right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I want to welcome you to the ZEBx November Decarb Lunch webinar hosted by the Building to Electrification Coalition, V2.0, and the Building Decarbonization Alliance. I'm Mariko Makashu, the Program Manager for V2.0. Today, we're launching a brand new guide focused on commercial building electrification retrofits. You'll hear from two of the guide's authors to learn more about how to use it. To kick things off, I'd first like to share my gratitude to be able to join you today from the unceded traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. I also want to give thanks to the City of Vancouver, Natural Resources Canada, and BC Hydro for their financial support for this free educational series. If you're interested in getting continuing education credits for attending today, please see the information that Carrie, my colleague, is going to drop into the chat. Please also use the chat to comment and ask questions for the presenters and the rest of the audience. If you like a question being asked in the chat, please like it on the screen, and that's your way of upvoting it. We'll use these questions to help guide our discussion at the end of the hour. ZEBx and V2.0 are both part of a family of programs nested within the federally endowed Zero Emissions Innovation Center, also known as ZEBx, the BC contingent of the Low Carbon Cities Network. ZEBx is part of the Building Decarbonization team and is a main convener and amplifier of content developed by us. It's a first point of contact for those who are either unsure about how to approach the world of building decarbonization or want to be updated about all of our programs. V2.0 is more specifically focused on electrification as a means to achieve low carbon buildings. Other programs in our building decarbonization team include the BC Retrofit Accelerator, focused on retrofits, Near Zero for research and innovation and incentives, and the Carbon Leadership Forum for all things embodied carbon. ZEBx compiles and synthesizes this content from all the specialist program areas and promotes cross-program interdisciplinary work. ZEBx is more than just a building decarbonization team. We have colleagues who specialize in communications, economic transformation, sustainable workforce, granting, and all working towards accelerating decarbonization. A bit more about V2.0. We are a BC-based coalition which has over 200 organizational members. We see electrification as the critical pathway to achieve deep, immediate, and real emissions reductions. We launched this first in Canada coalition in late 2021, and it serves to coordinate actions, encourage collaboration, and facilitate networking to accelerate the pace of building electrification in the province. We organize ourselves through committees, including our Leadership Council, Communications, Industry Capacity, and Technical Committees. Together, we are working on key priorities, which include increasing the capacity of contractors to deliver high-quality electrification projects, support the uptake of retrofits, addressing peak demand and load management strategies, and helping building owners to plan for electrification of building systems. So if you don't see your organization's logo on this list, I would encourage you to become a member. It's easy and free. You just have to visit our website, click the button, get involved, and then sign our member declaration. In recent years, V2.0's committees have narrowed in on specific topics that we think are going to help us to achieve our strategic priorities. In the early days of the technical committee, which includes a lot of engineering practitioners, there was a lot of discussion around best practices around retrofits. While every building is a snowflake, many of the solutions and strategies to approach retrofits are replicable. Given that the majority of commercial buildings stock already exists, the mechanical systems will last 15 years or more, and envelopes last even longer. It is imperative that we decarbonize building systems with each retrofit to avoid locking ourselves into higher GHG emissions for another 15 plus years. Many of V2.0's members have led progressive electrification projects and wanted to help others in simplifying the process for retrofit implementation. The goal is to build industry capacity to accelerate the pace of adoption. The policy landscape is also evolving to include the management of existing building emissions, not just new construction. So provincially, through the highest efficiency equipment standard, all space and water heating equipment sold in or after 2030 must be at least 100% efficient. And more locally, the City of Vancouver will require large commercial buildings to meet annual limits for carbon pollution starting in 2026. And that will increase steadily over time with more requirements and the types of building and sizes of buildings being covered under the requirement. So the Commercial Building Electrification Guide is intended to help us meet those future requirements by supporting engineering designers who are newer to retrofits, as well as those who are familiar with retrofits already. There's also several sections that are going to help other people within the industry, including building owners, managers, and prime consultants. We want to thank additional funding partners, BC Hydro, Metro Vancouver, and the City of Vancouver, as well as the project team, SES Consulting, and First Light Energy to bring this guide to life. I'm now going to pass it off to my co-host, Brian Flanagan, who is the Executive Director for the Building Decarbonization Alliance, to tell us a bit more about the work that they're doing on a national scale. Over to you, Brian.
Yeah, thank you, Mariko. Well, first of all, thank you very much to Zeke and V2.0 for having us co-host this. We think that the guide is just a really important resource. Our work is very reflective nationally of the work that V2.0 does, so we're really big fans. You can go to the next slide, Mariko. So the Building Decarbonization Alliance, very similar to the V2.0, but on a national scale, is an alliance of leaders built from across the entire building ecosystem who share an interest in advancing electrification and heating end uses for all of our buildings. And as of the last time I checked, we have, I think, about 260 partners all across the country who come from all subsectors: government, architects and engineers, civil society, building owners, et cetera. You can go to the next slide. We're active in 4 principal activity areas. We're really interested in economic and market development opportunities associated with electrification. Obviously, we have a climate imperative in front of us, but we also see this as a tremendous opportunity to renew our buildings, to create jobs, to have wonderful and comfortable homes and businesses to go into, and to create competitive environment in Canada for businesses to come and invest. Of course, we have to balance that with affordability question, and so the impacts on the grid and driving costs are something that we have to really keep in checking. Making sure that the transition is accessible to everyone is an area of concern for us, and a lot of our research looks into that. The third I alluded to a little bit is energy system readiness. So all of the impacts associated with electrification and the investments necessary in our energy system to maintain the vision that we have of an electrified future. And last but not least, making sure that consumers and building owners understand the benefits of doing this and understand the processes by which this can take place, so that they can drive demand and they can insist on change in their own right. So we enact those 4 issue areas by undertaking activities in a couple of different spaces, by activating our network and by applying our resources and policy analysis, and engaging the sector in building capacity and really causing unlikely meetings to happen among participants in the space. And by really advancing what we think is really strong techno-economic analysis, we activate our network to ground truth our assumptions, either by subsector or by region of the country, to make sure that the work that we're doing has input assumptions that are validated by the industry and supported by the industry, and not just created sort of in a bit of a vacuum. And we think that's a really important part of the work that we do. And the last is really looking at technologies and alternative solutions to be sure that electrification remains the most viable pathway. We want to keep our eyes open to other technologies that can help support that, like behind the meter technologies, thermal storage, thermal energy networks, and things like that that will support the transition through and make sure that it's as smooth as possible. You can go to the next slide. So some of you may have seen some of our work. We've been quite busy since our founding about 1.5 years ago. Our work takes place in those 4 key areas: policy analysis, sector engagement capacity, techno-economic analysis, and researching technology alternatives. All of this material is available on our website, and depending on what part of the ecosystem you're from and the issue that you're concerned with on any given day, you can find pieces of our work that relate to the grid, that relate to how quickly we're decarbonizing through our pace of progress report, and just continuing to build the case for why electrification is the most viable pathway forward. And this commercial retrofit guide really fits into that sector engagement and capacity piece. From our perspective, we know that through our work on the pace of progress report, which you can see there in the upper left-hand corner in the icons, in the residential sector, we're about a third of the way into the pace that we need to be to get on track to a 2050 goal. We really need to accelerate the pace of retrofits in the residential space. But in the commercial space, we don't have the research to back it, but we're really seeing and hearing a very similar sort of story from the industry that the pipeline and the deal flow that you would expect to have just really isn't to the level that we need to see it. And part of that is because electrification retrofits are just not the same as traditional building projects or even energy efficiency retrofits. There's quite a lot that's different, and we want to make sure that the industry has the capacity and really understands the nuance and difference there. And so our organization is quite keen to help amplify this work. We really see it as an important strategy to build capacity and make sure that the influence, the great influence that architects and engineers have across the country, working with their clients, the building owner community, really have the best and latest practices at their disposal to make sure that these projects paper well and that the projects are ultimately really successful to build sort of the momentum that we want to build about the positive stories that are here. So we'll get into that in a second. There's one last slide, shameless plug. You can go to like V2.0, becoming a partner in the Building Decarbonization Alliance. It's free. It's super easy. Just go to our website, click the link, read the declaration, which we think most people that are on this call would be able to support, and you can become a partner. So we'd really appreciate that as well. Without further ado, I think we should get into the guide. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Stephanie Poole, the principal of SES Consulting, and Mike Reimer, the principal of First Light Energy Solutions, who are going to walk us through the process that got us to the guide.
Awesome. Thanks, Brian. Everyone can see that? Yes? Awesome. Okay. Yay. Hello and welcome. Thank you. We are so excited to officially present this. Anyone who knows me has just been hearing me speak about this for months and months and months. So it's so exciting that it's finally done. Okay, let's talk about it a little bit. So you've heard a little bit about this from Mariko and Brian. I'll touch on these briefly as well, and then we have lots of time for questions at the end. You're probably thinking, why do we need another guide? I know there's tons of research being done through BDA, through all of the other organizations, but we feel like this guide addresses a gap that has not yet been filled. And there are kind of three main drivers on here, which you can see. So the biggest one that I know Brian touched on here is that deep energy retrofits and electrification projects are still being designed and managed and implemented in the same way that like a like-for-like equipment replacement or a simple retrofit is being done. And because these projects are so much more complex, they have unique challenges, they need a distinct approach. Even the metrics that we're using to compare and analyze projects, like even those need to be different. You might want to look at a full life cycle cost analysis for your electrification project, whereas you're probably not going to do that for a like-for-like boiler replacement. So they really need to be managed differently. And that is one of the things we focus on in the guide, is like how to go about doing that. The second one here is that, again, as Mariko and Brian both noted, overall, the industry still lacks this experience to deliver low carbon projects that consistently meet long-term performance and emissions targets and actually provide this reliable and lasting operation. I hear all the time from operators or building owners who are kind of on the bleeding edge of this work. They've tried low carbon technologies, they've tried heat pumps, they've faced issues, and now they're hesitant to invest in similar solutions. And this is a really big deal, because if low carbon technologies develop a poor reputation for underperformance, it's going to discourage further adoption and put our broader emissions targets at risk, as Brian mentioned. So we really want to get on top of this and start producing electrification projects that are actually like seen as a good thing in the industry. And then the last one, like why we're actually doing the guide right now, is we feel as though the market is ready. There's incentive programs, pending regulations, they're driving increased adoption. But in some cases, we are seeing the regulatory progress lag a little bit. So we are thinking that an industry consensus, some of this documentation might help support the government efforts to advance these initiatives. And we also feel like at this point, there's enough people who have been doing this. They've completed these projects, they've gathered lessons learned, and there's a growing consensus on best practices. So it's really a good time to start sharing this knowledge because we actually have some now. Oh, actually, Mike, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, just like this is a really big challenge, right? Like to meet these decarbonization goals, and it requires a collaborative approach. So as part of this, like Stephanie said, is starting to document lessons learned and best practices. But the hope with this, and we'll get into it a bit more, is for active participation and engagement with the guide and to provide future updates with it, because collectively we need to be working together on this problem, right? It's not a single consultant firm isn't going to solve this issue, right? It's going to take the whole community to do that. So yeah.
That is a perfect transition into my next slide, Mike. So who contributed? So just for the record, it was not just SES and First Light who wrote this guide. We have a ton of collaborators, which you can see on the first or second page of the guide. Collaborators across, mechanical, structural, electrical, architectural, lots of equipment manufacturers, contractors, building owners who have had these systems in their building, who have had ones that have failed and ones that are working really well and have lots of input. So we're drawing on extensive industry experience from a range of contributors who actually have this hands-on experience in these low carbon projects.
Yeah, and then as part of the guide too is referencing work that's already done. So the idea was to try to avoid rehashing stuff where there already are a lot of good references out there. So hopefully point to some of those references in addition to what's in the guide itself.
Perfect. Okay, so how is this guide different from the other documentation? As Mike said, we're not copying any of the existing documentation. We're not reinventing this. We are referencing things where they do exist. But in general, this guide is meant to be really comprehensive. It's not just technical and it's not just process. We want to look at both. So when I say process, like you have 50 buildings, where do you start? You want to do a low carbon plan. What do you do? What's the optimal order to implement measures in to optimize efficiency and minimize costs? And then there's a lot of technical considerations because the original audience for this guide is technical consultants. So there's a lot of stuff in there, common controls issues for heat pumps, how to remedy them. I'll let Mike talk about a bunch of those, but there's a bunch of the technical things in there. The other piece is that it's holistic. So we're looking at electrification as a holistic approach where electrification is an opportunity to fully optimize your building systems, all of them, and reduce overall energy performance, ideally improve performance, comfort. You want operations to have an easier job after the electrification project so that they're happy with these, not hate them because they make their jobs harder. Like that's not what we're trying to do here. We want these to be well received across the stakeholder group. And then the last piece, as Mike mentioned, is that it is meant to be collaborative. Like this is our first pass. There's a lot of experts, but by no means were we able to capture everyone's voice. So this is meant to evolve and adapt as the industry continues to grow and change.
Yeah, and then one of the challenges with this space is technology is moving quick, right? Like we already see new heat pump technologies coming out. 2 years from now, there'll be new stuff we haven't even thought of. So as part of the guide, especially in the technical pieces, there was an emphasis on first principles approach as much as possible versus a technology specific approach. So hopefully a lot of these first principles translate independent of the actual technology. And the other kind of bent of the guide is approaching consultants who may be more familiar with new construction, but maybe don't know all or haven't experienced all the nuances of retrofit work. And those of you who have done that know it can be quite different than a new construction project. So just providing the reader with those tools to avoid pitfalls in those areas.
Yeah, that's awesome, Michael. We'll touch a little bit on the chapters here, but we're not trying to summarize the guide because it's like a lot of pages and that would take a long time. Okay, so this electrification principle, this like holistic approach. This is what I'm talking about here. And again, I'm trying not to put too many slides from the guide because it will be a huge presentation. But I think this is important because this is really the guiding principle behind the guide. This holistic electrification is the lens around which everything was framed. So we're creating these projects where, again, we're reducing efficiency, we're reducing overall energy use to make our electrification and our deep energy retrofit projects more financially attractive, more feasible, more attractive to the stakeholders. We want to actually right-size the equipment based on real data. There's a big section on that, using real data in retrofits so that we're not oversizing things and not creating really expensive projects that aren't going to move forward. We're looking at complementary improvements across all the building systems, and we're trying to achieve long-term performance. So the goal here is we're creating the types of electrification projects that are going to build a strong reputation for electrification and encourage increased adoption. Mike?
Yeah, I think we can talk about it in the next slides too, but I noticed there was a question about climate resilience, and as part of that, maybe when we get into the sections, there are considerations in here too around using these retrofits as an opportunity for other benefits within your building, right? Like an electrification project is a great opportunity to provide cooling where you don't have cooling, or improve the resilience of your building for future climate events. So there is content in there, and maybe we'll talk about that as we get into the kind of outline as well. Yeah, next slide.
So here's our outline. These are the chapters. Again, there's lots of sub-chapters in here that you're not seeing, but there's a section in here, or it's broken up for different stakeholders. So this was originally developed for engineering consultants. There's lots of technical sections in here written by very smart people, but there's also sections if you're a little bit less technical, if you're a building owner or an energy manager, the person that's kind of managing it from the client side. There's things on here like where to start, what's the optimal order, how to do integrated design, those kinds of things that would be a little bit less technical and more process-based. So we have a little section in here on like, I'm this person, which parts of the guide should I read? Where should I go? Where should I start? And then these are the chapters. So we cover the whole retrofit process from planning through to design, lots on design, into construction, big section on commissioning, because this is an area that we often see overlooked, and it's actually causing a lot of the issues when we go in to reevaluate buildings. So we have a lot on there. We've got M&V and beyond, kind of ongoing maintenance and monitoring. And then as part of the guide, we're using lots of diagrams and flow charts and case studies to kind of help make this very technical content digestible. So in here, we've got example pathways, which also on the next slide, lots of case studies with examples. And all of these are broken up with like little flow charts. So it can be a little bit like a choose your own adventure. You can kind of go here if you want to read this and go to that section if you're interested in only this.
Yeah, and we'll show an example pathway, which is kind of highlights the choose your own adventure nature of the guide. But I think kind of there's, from a consultant's point of view, there's kind of two big challenges with implementing retrofits that someone who coming from new construction may not have dealt with in the past. So the first three sections really cover that, right? So there's owner's considerations, business case, that sort of thing. Chapter 5, as a consultant, for me, that's a pretty important one. A lot of mechanical consultants maybe haven't acted as a prime consultant on a project before. So there's some guidelines and guidance on that, because that can make or break a retrofit project, is the proper planning and management from a prime consultant role. And then as we get into part 4, that's really like the technical meat of the guide. There are some great things in there for other audiences, but it really is geared towards the consultants within a retrofit context. So there's a lot of knowledge that consultants bring, and this is through the lens of specifically from a retrofit point of view. So, you know, we get into heat pumps there, for example, types of heat pumps, common issues with applying heat pumps. A lot of it is focused on water-based systems, because you can get into a lot of trouble with those. The heating, ventilation, air conditioning section is really about how to analyze your building, use the data that's available, because unlike a new construction project where we have to rely on an energy model because the building doesn't exist, there's a lot of information available. So guidance on leveraging that, as well as preparing your systems to be compatible with heat pump or electrification technology. Domestic hot water systems has a similar bent to it. And then the last three really are supporting chapters to support that electrification process with electrical, structural, and building envelope considerations.
Perfect. So here's an example of like one of the decision trees that we have. This one is for an RTU, gas-fired RTU, or like a unitary furnace or something like that. I picked one of the simple ones that would fit nicely on a page. But you can see, we've got initial system investigation and reduce load. So that's a huge component. I know someone mentioned in the chat about electrical capacity. So we have sections on, reducing heating load, reducing electrical load, so that you're doing that first, right? To free up some capacity to make your building more efficient so that you can downsize your equipment and ideally work within your existing electrical infrastructure. Where possible, not always possible. So we've got, you're checking your existing requirements, and you can see this is where the choose your own adventure comes in. It'll just tell you, to read about existing codes and requirements and understanding the existing system. Here's where you go. Then you're reducing load for a gas-fired ventilation system. These are the sections you would go. And then this is an example of what your decision tree might look like. This is by no means what every decision tree is going to look like. This was just meant to be an example to help you understand and to help you, figure out the considerations and where to look. So you can see, structural considerations using data-driven design. So using data to size your equipment, that's under here. We always look at considering like a hybrid versus full electric, because in some cases you are going to be constrained, or if the life cycle cost analysis doesn't make sense. These sections are all the sections you might want to look when you're making that decision of, am I going to go hybrid or am I going to go fully electric? And then, yeah, so that's the example.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add to that, Stephanie.
Okay, perfect. So that's all we got. We got lots of time for questions. This is where to get the guide. This is the link. I imagine someone is also popping that in the chat. This 2 days ago said notify me, but now it says download guide because the guide is officially ready and you can actually just go and download it directly. So go to this link and we are open for questions.
That's great. Thanks so much, Stephanie and Mike. Great presentation. We've got a couple questions in the chat. I'll just see things first. Mike, you alluded to it a little bit about the idea that this is a living document or intended to be a living document, and that by no means is this at first blush fully comprehensive from day one, and that collaboration and more input is going to be required. Maybe you could just expand a little bit on what that looks like from your perspective, and what the hope for process might be to keep that greenfield document kind of going.
Sure,
or
yeah.
Evergreen document.
Yeah. So it's kind of like we've started from a blank page. We've got pen to paper. We've got, the first version of this, but there's a lot of experience in our industry, and a lot of very smart people who have different experiences. And so we really want and hope that the guide is a touching off point for discussions and for other folks to provide input and recommendations. So we're hoping that this is version 1 of many. I mean, we've talked, I don't want to commit to anything, Marika, but we've talked about, is there a mechanism for like a continuous maintenance cycle to update this as more knowledge is gained in the industry, right? And this also focuses on BC specifically, or largely. A lot of it is transferable to other provinces, but obviously BC has a unique grid compared to, say, Alberta or Saskatchewan. So that does change things in how you approach decarbonization and electrification somewhat. So also wanting to leverage some experience from other municipalities and other provinces as well. As part of that. And Marika, maybe you want to speak to how folks can get involved?
I can do that. So on that landing page where you can download the guide, there is also a link to a form. So you could submit your comments there. I'm not promising that we're doing anything about that right away, as Mike said, but we will incorporate that feedback into future iterations when and if that happens. We also were thinking if you were very interested in collaborating and being one of the contributors to the next version, you could also use that form to indicate your interest in that as well. So I'll just move to one of the next questions. I think it's kind of combining a couple questions here. And it's related to, district energy, campus energy, geo-exchange. So how does the design, coefficient of performance of various heat pump strategies and their grid impacts come into consideration with this guide?
Yeah, so we've taken an efficiency first approach in how we lay out and approach the recommendations and the guidelines within the guide. So really there's a lot in there. Like if you look at the HVAC chapter and the domestic hot water chapter, there's a lot of discussion and recommendations on load reduction. So whether that's through actual equipment changes or based on experience, a lot of control measures can result in quite drastic demand and or consumption reduction. So that's one component of it. The other component then, and this is a tricky one in existing buildings, is really your COP is really dependent on the lift, right? So your cold temperature and your hot temperature, and really getting those heating water temperatures down. So there are strategies and discussion in the guide around focusing on that and looking at optimizing that first before applying your technology. There's also in the heat pump section discussion on various sources and maybe some less common sources of heat for heat pumps to consider as well within existing buildings.
Great response. This question that really stood out for me from Sharuk, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. They're talking about using real-time data in an existing facility, obviously, and saying that they're working on a project and they have some information from the direct digital control system, but the client really has very little information about the manufacturers of the air handling units or nameplate data or shop drawings or equipment schedules. I mean, they're really kind of starting from scratch, I think, in a lot of ways. And it's an older building, and they're wondering, does the guide cover strategies to help deal with some of those kinds of aspects that we run into when we're trying to do retrofit projects in existing, especially older buildings?
There is some content on that, yes, as far as what information you should be looking at, when, how to approach it, sort of. I mean, you always kind of need to approach it from two angles with data, right? Is you've got your greater utility data, and then hopefully you've got some more like, hourly DDC data or trend logs. It's tough when you don't have actual cut sheets on the equipment, but using that approach can usually help, calibrate a model to kind of help make you or allow you to make informed decisions. Like it's never going to be perfect, but there is some discussion on that in there as well, especially when it comes to HVAC and domestic hot water systems.
Yeah, I'll just add that in the domestic hot water section, I mean, it's very common that you don't have a lot of data on your domestic hot water. So we talk about, how you might want to get that data. Do you want to install a temporary meter, and why adding those types of things are going to pay off in the long run? So we do talk about, if you don't have data, what might you consider?
Yeah. And another thing, this is maybe kind of off topic from this, but it will relate. Hopefully I can explain it properly. But one of the mindsets too, like coming from new construction typically is a project. You design the project, you tender it, you build it, it's done. And typically you're moving on to the next project. One of kind of the mindset changes with these buildings is like viewing yourself as the consultant as a partner with that client. And a lot of times, if you don't have the information, it might actually mean taking a step back and letting the client know, like the best course of action here is that we need to gather more data, and that might mean delaying the project a fiscal cycle. But a lot of times that's in the best interest of the client because it might mean that they actually are going to be spending less money on the upgrade with proper data. So, and a lot of times these upgrades are not a one-off and you're done. we need to work within the fiscal cycles of the clients. So viewing this more as like an ongoing multi-project relationship can kind of open those options when you're running into struggles with information.
I think that question kind of leads into another one that I had around common pitfalls. Like, I understand that a lot of the contributors to this guide have a lot of experience implementing electrification retrofits already. And I'm sure that you have a lot of lessons learned to share. So how are those incorporated into the guide?
Do you want to start, Stephanie, maybe with some of the case studies, and then I can chime in?
Yeah, so I'm just sharing our chapters here. The considerations are built into the chapters, but for example, under implementation considerations, there's lots of topics on where things often go wrong. And so what are some considerations you should take to avoid that, like spending more time on commissioning or having a more collaborative approach or things like that that are going to help avoid the common pitfalls. We also get into those in some of the case studies. We specifically identify like what went wrong in these case studies and what the issue was and how it was fixed, which I think is a different lens than you'll see for some case studies. And then also, yeah, I'll let Mike talk about the technical sections.
Yeah, so we don't really have one chapter that's like, here's all the things we've seen and here's how to fix them. Like Stephanie said, they have been embedded throughout. So for example, in the heat pump chapter, probably a lot of you mechanical engineers have dealt with modular heat recovery chillers or heat pumps and some of the challenges surrounding them. So there's specifically a section on modular heat pumps. So within there's, flagging potential issues and applying them and methods to evolve running into issues with that specific equipment. So as much as we try to remain first principles based, there is also some specific equipment recommendations because like most of the time we're dealing with issues with either controls or equipment, right? So again, also with compressor selection. So there's a section on compressor selection, provides recommendations and cautions when selecting different types of compressors for heat recovery applications. So it's kind of embedded throughout.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, it's sort of related to another question that I'm seeing here that I think is a really important one is just the question of making the business case for something that is a more comprehensive electrification retrofit. Does the guide get into sort of the different value streams or the different cost profiles and how an owner or an engineering firm might justify that for the client, like really building the business case that's tailored specifically to this type of a project?
Why, yes, Brian, there is an entire chapter called Life Cycle Cost Analysis and Building the Business Case. So that would be under the electrification planning process. So that goes through the whole process. So, you're starting with identifying opportunities, you're analyzing the opportunities, then you're comparing the opportunities. And so we walk you through, how to develop a business case, what the life cycle cost analysis might look like, how it's different than a deep energy retrofit electrification type business case. What are some of the metrics you might use? What are the non-quantitative considerations that you might want to use? So like adding cooling, other benefits, those kinds of things to build that business case. And so that's part of that planning process because you're basically, identifying, analyzing, and then evaluating your opportunities before you're moving into that implementation. So that's where we cover all of those pieces.
Thanks, Stephanie. There is a comment/question that was at the beginning of the chat that keeps like coming back to me here. And it's kind of like that existential crisis of, our building managers or consultants perceiving like for like replacements as doing their jobs rather than looking at, the fulsome electrification and not, how do we get to a place where we're not considering electrification as going above and beyond? Like we are actually future-proofing our buildings by complying with future standards and things like that. So is there anything in the guide that addresses this? And then if not, do you have any comments on that?
It's a really good question. I think we talk, and Stephanie, feel free to jump in too. I think we do talk in the guide about those other co-benefits with electrification. But it is a change in mindset. I mean, even decarb and electrification aside, it's just viewing any, anytime you need to replace or maintain your building as an opportunity to do it better, whether that's like even electrification, decarb aside, is there something you can do to improve the thermal comfort in the building for your occupants, for example, right? Rather than I'm just going to do like for like and kind of leave it as is. So it's kind of like this mindset of continual improvement and incremental improvements that I think electrification and decarb projects are helping to drive, but I think that's a quality that, if I was a building owner, I'd want in a consultant I was having work on a project. Is like I want them to help me identify um, opportunities to improve things rather than just, pick the same piece of equipment, put it on a drawing and get it out, right? And do it off the side of my desk. So it's just a change in mindset, really. Um,
Yeah, maybe I'll just add to that. A couple weeks ago, maybe a month ago, Kit from KingSet and I did a presentation on like building the business case for decarbonization and electrification projects specifically. It's recorded, so you can go check it out on the ZEBx website. But that is all built into this guide. So we're really aiming to leverage that information from building owners and property managers who do that, who are like basically making the case to stakeholders that it is not an extra, this is a requirement because of the carbon risks. It actually does make sense. So the guide it does aim to equip the people making that case with that information and help them pull in some of the considerations that may not be really obvious, like how to consider carbon risk in order to make your business case and present to the stakeholders that actually this makes more sense long term. So all of that is built in, as well as some of the ways that some of the bigger property managers are doing this, are making this case, are moving into electrification and getting stakeholders involved. So that's all built into the guide, specifically around the like evaluating and where to start, kind of start small, do a good electrification project, get buy-in, go bigger. So it's all built into the guide. If you look in the first, I would say, planning and implementation sections, those are the less technical, more process-based, and they'll help you with those pieces.
Yeah, and that's great, Stephanie. And yeah, and in the technical piece, there is some commentary on, especially in the HVAC and heat pump section, is keeping things as simple as possible, right? Like operators have to live with these systems. And even if on paper it seems like something really complicated is going to eke out 2 or 3% or 5% more energy savings, if in practice it's so complicated that someone can't operate it, you're not going to realize those savings, right? So there's some commentary in the guide around that too. It's like we have to be pragmatic in how we implement these things.
Yeah, I think it's really important to note that the electrification guide, the outcome of looking through these process maps and going through these is not always full electrification. Like we're not pitching that regardless of the scenario. What we're doing is equipping you with the knowledge to make the decision. And it may be that for your building, it makes sense to electrify one system and leave the others for now because it's just not feasible based on all of the considerations that you look at in the guide. And that's totally fine. The electrification guide is not meant to be like, you must fully electrify. I mean, if you look at our little flow here, it's like you may end up not going full electric. You may end up with hybrid, and then you may end up with some additional supplemental heating. So it looks at all the possible paths.
I think that's a really interesting clarification, Stephanie, because I think the nature or sort of so the tone of some of the questions almost seems to imply that we're saying, no, this is about a full switch away from fossil fuels all the way to full electrification. And I mean, there's lots of different roadmaps to get to full electrification eventually as part of the 2050 decarbonization objective or whatever the local requirements might be. Certainly probably doesn't have to be right away and probably often isn't advisable to do that right away, depending on the building. There were another couple of questions that I can kind of lump together, one from Andrew and Carrie, that sort of spoke to the utility planning side of this. around sort of the building's service and requirements of the local utility to service any increase of capacity, and sort of the dynamic between a project proponent and the local electrical utility as you embark on an electrification project, to make sure that there aren't going to be any surprises, and that the service for the facility is going to be well served, but the utility will obviously be ready. I wonder if you could just touch on how much of the guide deals with that, if at all, and what the considerations might kind of look like from your perspective on it.
Yeah, so the electrical section deals with that extensively. So BC Hydro was one of the stakeholders in this, so we worked with them on that chapter. So there are, and Stephanie and I didn't write that chapter. We had an electrical consultant on the team who worked on that one. And so that's kind of the big focus of that one, as well as load reduction, is doing your load studies up front and being proactive in dealing with BC Hydro for any service upgrades. So that's all kind of contained in there. That process can be complicated depending on the building. So the guide doesn't, again, it's not necessarily simple answers, but it's guidance on how to approach that. Every project's going to be specific. Different areas of the province are grid constrained. So there are going to be limits on potentially on how that project proceeds.
All right. I have another question that isn't coming from the chat directly. Sorry, everyone. But it's more along the common philosophy of envelope first. And I'm just curious how this guide addresses building envelope versus mechanical systems.
Yeah, so this guide is geared towards commercial electrification. There is a small section on architectural considerations and building envelope. It's generally focused on supporting the electrification process. So there isn't a large component on like reskinning a building in this. Like in the planning phase, there's some commentary on that, and Stephanie, you can probably speak to that in more detail. But based on our experience collectively, I think Stephanie would say the same thing, at least in BC, specifically in kind of the lower mainland and Fraser Valley. From a economic and cost point of view, the reskinning of a commercial high-rise typically is not the most effective way to drastically reduce your carbon emissions. On a new construction project, yes, envelope first makes a lot of sense. You haven't built the building, you have a lot of opportunity to impact the passive performance of the building, and you should be doing that. But again, from an existing building point of view and from an operating budget point of view of your client, likely they're not going to have, it could be $30 million to replace envelope on a large commercial office building. Versus spending a few $1,000,000 to implement heat recovery and drastically reduce their emissions. And that's where, again, with the guide, like dealing with an existing building, is there are obviously for new construction best practices and approaches, but within the constraints of an existing building, sometimes we need to be pragmatic in how we best spend our clients' money to achieve these reductions.
I'll just add, in terms of the principles and the process there, if you look in load reduction, it does talk about, like when to analyze building envelope, because that would be covered under load reduction before you do your mechanical system design. And basically the story is you should analyze it. You should include it as one of the decision makers, and then you decide for your specific building if it makes sense. And we've added a couple things in there, like it might make sense if your windows are single pane, or they're due to replace anyway, or you have a bunch of drafts. Like there's always going to be considerations where that's going to make a lot of sense. But as Mike said, overall, that's not typically the process that makes the most sense, that actually gets selected, just because it is so much more cost intensive. But in here, it's meant to be like, here are the things you consider in this order, but you don't necessarily do all of them. And so in some cases, you're in northern BC, maybe that does make sense. Maybe that is one of the measures you select in load reduction. So it is meant to be geared towards your building. And it's not a like, you must do these measures in this order. It's more of a like, you should consider these, but in some cases it won't make sense. I see one other note in the chat here about energy storage, and I just want to note that there is a big subchapter under heat pump on energy storage. It's not omitted, I promise. We talk about that a lot. It's just a subchapter.
Yeah, thermal energy storage is, it's critical for building decarb. Yeah, and then I think also just to kind of button up on the envelope discussion is there are a lot of resources out there on building envelope, specifically like with respect to MERBs, and that sort of thing. Really the choice on this was to focus on, there's a lot of operational challenges and potential issues with active systems in the building. So we really wanted to focus on providing lessons learned and considerations around those, because those tend to be the biggest headache for the building operators as well.
Great answer. The topic is always interesting to really dig into. There's a question in the chat. This is kind of tangential to the question directly, but the guide was obviously developed with groups from British Columbia, and this presentation is mostly targeted to people in that province. I wonder if you could just comment. I mean, from our perspective at the BDA, we think this is a wonderful tool. We hope that others will have lots to learn from it, kind of regardless of where they are. I wonder if you could just comment though on how specific is this to jurisdictional questions within British Columbia specifically, and how much of it might be generically applicable to anybody that has an interest in a decarbonization retrofit that might want to tap into the resources that are there that are not in British Columbia.
That's a good question. Yeah, so I think generally this is very applicable to other jurisdictions, but the emphasis of certain strategies changes. So, for example, in Saskatchewan, like applying heat pump technology still can make sense. Your sources might be different. So this isn't just focused on like, hey, just use air source heat pump. We're in BC, like he's even northern BC, that might not make sense. But so it does cover a broad range of technologies and first principles. But for example, if you're out in Saskatchewan, now doing load reduction becomes a lot more important from a decarbonization point of view, just because of your electrical grid makeup. It also changes from an operating cost point of view, your break-even COP. So in order to save money, operating money, you have to really look at those efficiencies and those water temperatures to make sure you're applying heat pumps at higher COPs. And that's also where, again, you probably will be looking into building envelope type strategies. So looking at resources that would provide input there. But as far as the principles, I think they do translate across into other grid regions for sure.
Yeah, I think, all of the sections on the process and what effective decarbonization looks like and how to do the life cycle cost analysis so that you can compare the options, that's all transferable. It's just that what you select is likely going to be different. If you're looking at the net present value per ton of an envelope in Alberta versus in BC, what you're going to see from that and what you may decide to select is going to be very different. But the principles and what you're going to use to make those decisions, the calculations, the process, all of that is going to be the same.
Thanks both. There is one question around project financing options. So is there anything in the guide that speaks to that? And if not, maybe do we want to consider that for future editions?
Sorry, Mariko, can you just repeat that one more time? I was reading a comment in the chat.
Is there anything within the guide that addresses project financing at the moment?
There is, yeah. So we did put in a section on, and again, that's from the presentation that we did on making the business case in there. If you look at the slides, we talk a lot about like where you might access financing and what the benefits of and what the drawbacks might be. I actually originally wrote an entire section on project financing and incentives, but by the time I had written it and come back to it 2 weeks later, like 2 of the incentive programs were closed and one of the, like it just changes so rapidly, and we're trying to make this guide not obsolete in a year. So we didn't put specific like, you should use this program and you should access this funding. But we do talk about it in especially building the business case and, like how to get people on board, how to make your life cycle cost analysis look more attractive. It is built into there, but the specifics of what types of programs and what the names of them are not.
All right. Did you want to jump in on that, Mike?
No, I think you covered it, Stephanie.
All right. And I'm not sure how much more time we want to have for questions, Mariko, but I think I would have one for each of Stephanie and Mike around just the content in the guide that really stands out for you. You guys are the lead authors here. What are the real pieces that resonate for each of you in terms of the content that you think is maybe most important to highlight?
Do you want to go first?
Go
I can go. If you,
go.
I think like the nice thing, like so we worked really collaboratively together on this, the two companies, which was a lot of fun to do. And I think like I know we learned a lot from SES with their contributions to it, and I hope it was the other way as well.
Definitely vice versa.
Yeah, and so like that was kind of even just the process that was nice to collaborate with. Like we both compete and we're consultants in the same area, but this is just such a big challenge and a big issue that working together on something in this way has been a lot of fun, and learning what other folks are doing is a great way to disseminate knowledge. I think for me, and I know for my team, is a lot of the early stuff. I know that it's not necessarily like primary audience isn't designer, but it's really important background information for a young engineer or a consultant who has not been exposed to like the business side of things, owners, what drives owner decisions, all of that, even the role of the prime consultant. Like to me, that's really important, and especially for our younger engineers coming up, I think it's really important to have that. I think technically the technical content in here is good, but that's what we focus on so much day to day that it's really nice to have a well-rounded section on more of the softer skills and the non-technical approach to the projects, because missing any of that is a huge difference between a successful or unsuccessful project.
Yeah, I think for us we got to write into this things that we've been telling clients and building owners and people for years and years and years. And, sometimes they listen and sometimes they don't, but things like, commissioning. There's a huge section on commissioning. And that's something that historically has been challenging. People are like, I don't want to spend money on commissioning. The project's done. Why are we still doing this? I don't want to do a full extra year. But then we're brought into the project 3 years later, and it's like this piece of equipment has never performed. I hate low carbon equipment is the story that I'm hearing from operators and building owners. So we got to write into that, like, okay, this is really important. And, for example, having a more collaborative approach. We've seen this enough in practice where it's like, okay, this project is following more of a collaborative approach and this one isn't, and this one's more successful. So we got to write into those some of the things that like we wish all the building owners would do. And I think those sections, like Mike said at the beginning, first of all, they're a little bit lighter of a read. I wouldn't probably go and read all the technical sections in a day, but this stuff, if you're starting out in electrification or deep energy retrofits and you want to understand like what are the things I can do along the way to make my project successful, these are a really good place to start. So then you remember, oh, commissioning is really important. Oh, it's really important that I involve the building operator early. And how can I do that? And what are some strategies? So I think some of that stuff, it is really the soft skills and that collaboration and communication piece that we see cause these projects to fail a lot of the time. So it was fun to get to write that in there.
That's great. Thanks so much. So I'm noticing that we have 1 minute left. I have a couple of shameless plugs to do, but before I do that, I really wanted to encourage everyone to go to the B2E website, download the guide, share it broadly. If you have a newsletter, please share it with your followers, subscribers, friends. We want this to be a really usable resource. And then if you have feedback, like we said, please use the feedback forums as well. So I just wanted to share a couple more slides from our perspective and actually maybe I won't be able to because technology for me today is not my friend. Another couple programs that you just need to know about, we have the Near Zero program that's open right now. There are a couple of streams of that might be of interest, but stream 4 in particular is related to real performance data of high efficiency homes. So if you have one or you know somebody who does, encourage them to get enrolled in that program. And secondly, we have another Decarb lunch in just a week on November 20th, next Wednesday, called Avoiding Common Pitfalls of Green Material Specification, Concrete, Steel, and Mass Timber. So that is an embodied carbon focused webinar. I really want to thank my co-host today, Brian Flanagan, for joining us and being part of this webinar. I want to thank Stephanie and Mike for contributing and leading this guide and then presenting on it today, and to all the other contributors who made this guide possible. So thanks everyone for joining us today, and looking forward to seeing you at the next Decarb lunch. Bye.